Let the waters wash over me. Let the river flow and cleanse my soul. And cleanse my soul. Wade in the water. Wade in the water.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Morissette, and I'm an artist, educator, organizer, and member of the Pigsgusset Initiative. I use the She series, and for those with vision impairments, I'm a white woman with long, straight brown hair, brown eyes. I'm wearing my hair back today, and I'm wearing a black shirt and a mustard yellow sweater and some big gold earrings. I'm honored to be here today as your facilitator in this event, Local Indigenous History, Educating Ourselves, Taking Action, and Moving Forward. Thank you for joining us today. A special shout out to Mwalim Peters and the Groovalados for the fantastic song selections as we entered the space today. Check out their website in the chat. And a reminder to everyone joining us, this session is being recorded. And if you're looking for captioning, there should be a button at the bottom bar of your Zoom screen called Live Transcript. That will allow you to show or hide the auto captions. Now, we're going to kick off our afternoon together with a Zoom poll. We want to get you all engaged right from the start. So, Jennifer, if you could launch the poll now, that would be great. Awesome, there it is. So if you're willing, please participate. A window will pop up on your screen. It should be there now, and you can follow the prompts to do your best to answer each question. we will share the results a little later in the webinar. And let's just hold for a couple moments for folks to engage with the poll. Great, so feel free to continue with the poll if you haven't finished. Don't want to rush you, but I am going to move on with the rest of our introduction. So to begin, we would like to acknowledge the land on which we live, work, and play. Now referred to as Watertown, this land is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Pigsgusset band of the Massachusetts people. Originally called Pigsgusset, which to the best of our knowledge means the meadows at the widening of the river. However, Pigsgusset is likely an English language corruption of an indigenous word. We make this acknowledgement to offer recognition and respect to the original inhabitants of this land and their descendants today, especially because the indigenous history of Watertown has been erased for the last 400 years. We encourage you now to share in the chat, if you haven't already, your name and where you're zooming in from. If you don't know what tribal land you are on, we encourage you to check out the website that we will drop in the chat. It's native-land.ca. And thank you, Jennifer, for dropping that in the chat. And a brief overview of what's planned for us today. We just went through our land acknowledgement. I'll continue with my introduction, welcome and introduction to Pigsgusset Initiative. We will then welcome on our panelists. The panelists will each share, and then they will have a discussion together, and then we'll finish up with some questions from all of you. Now, before we go into discussion together, Pigsgusset Initiative wanted to share some community agreements. We ask that everyone respect these agreements during our time together. Quickly go through these. First, step down. This means if you're someone who feels very comfortable sharing, take note of how often you're sharing and maybe consider giving some time for others to share. If you tend to be quiet and be a quiet participant, maybe take the chance today to step up with your idea, share your concerns, thoughts, and excitement with the group. Practice deep listening. Number 2, practice deep listening without judgment. Let's try to forgo the need to be right today and to have all the answers. Let's commit to number 3, learning and growing. To 4, speak personally, not positionally. When I think about this, I think about using the I statement when talking about my experiences or when asking a question or sharing a thought with the group. And number 5, be curious, caring, and open-minded. If someone or anyone is unable to respect these agreements today, you will be asked to leave the webinar. As you can see, our event today is on the Zoom webinar platform. Some of you may be really familiar with this during all of this COVID time, but others might not quite be as comfortable. So just so you know, at the bottom of your screen, there is a bar, and you will see there's a chat option and a Q&A option. Feel free to use the chat, as we've been doing, to say hi and drop any thoughts. But if you have specific questions for the panelists, please put those in the Q&A function there. So we can use both of those. We really want to hear from you. So please engage with these 2 functions as much as possible. And now, for those of you who are not as familiar with Pigsgusset Initiative, we are a working group of the Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment. The Pigsgusset Initiative seeks to increase communication and promote collaboration among Watertown residents to undo the erasure of Indigenous peoples from the place now called Watertown and to promote inclusive historical narratives. What do? As Pigsgusset Initiative members, we commit to educating ourselves and our neighbors. We work to challenge and change false narratives. And we're also each committed to our own ongoing learning, unlearning, and solidarity. We aim to build a culture of practice that can hold hard history as we heal and transform society and ourselves. And now, before we bring on our panelists, I'd love to see what happened with that poll. So Jennifer, if you can launch that up again and we can all see the results. Ah, fabulous. So wonderful when technology works. Okay, so everyone should be able to see the results of the poll that we took. Let's just go through it quickly together. So number one, the tribe that has lived on this land we now call Watertown for thousands of years before European coloners arrived is, and the correct answer is Massachusetts. So we have 55% saying Massachusetts, and that is the correct answer. Number two, the three sisters refer to, the correct answer, 87% got it, that's great. Corn, squash, and beans planted together for mutual benefit. Number three, Indigenous peoples referred to the land mass that is known as North America as, also we 61% got it right, Turtle Island, that is correct. Number four, the English version of the name for the area now called Watertown is Pigsgusset, which translates to, you should all know this because I just went through it, right? Meadows at the widening of the river, 92%. Nice job. And last question, the following place names are Indigenous: Mattapoisett, Cohasset, Nantucket, Nantasket, Kutroit. The et sound at the end of the name of a place means at the place of. What do you think Massachusetts means? The correct answer is at the place of the Blue Hills. So we almost got it, 34% there. Awesome. And apologies for some of those pronunciations. I will need to go back and make sure I have all those right. Great, so now we can invite on our panelists. So let me just do a little introduction. First, I'm thrilled to introduce our three panelists. We are so lucky to have them here today. First, Raquel Halsey. She is the Executive Director of North American Indian Center of Boston. Second, we have Mwalim, Morgan James Peters. He is Mashpee Wampanoag performing artist and a UMass Dartmouth professor and playwright. And last but not least, we have Dr. Mishy. She is the Learning Director of the Upstander project and co-founder of the Pigsgusset Initiative. Unfortunately, Matoe Monroe was unable to join us this afternoon due to illness, but we're so honored to have Raquel here to share about the legislation. More complete bios of each panelist can be found in the chat, so check those out. Jennifer will be dropping those in as we go. We also wanted to share with everyone here today that we did invite a member of the Massachusetts tribe, specifically Elizabeth Solomon, to join the panel given their ancestral connection to this land. But unfortunately, the tribal council is meeting at the exact same time that we gather for this event, so she was unable to join us, but we're sorry she's not here. And now, without further ado, thank you all so much for bearing with me as I went through all those housekeeping things. I'm thrilled to invite on Raquel. So Raquel, if you want to join us on video, and Raquel's going to share about the status of the MA Indigenous Legislative Agenda and how we can help support it. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. It's an honor to share this time and space and build with everyone who's here. My name is Raquel Halsey. I'm the Executive Director for the North American Indian Center of Boston. I'm a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, and I'm also Mexican and Puerto Rican. I join you today from Massachusetts territory. whose people, traditions, language, and stewardship continues through their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapaug. Massachusetts has more than 90,000 people of Native American and Alaska Native heritage. In addition, there are many thousands of Indigenous people here from Islander, Mayan, and Andean communities who are too often misclassified as Hispanic. The two federally recognized tribes in the state are the Aquinnah Wampanoag and the Mashpee Wampanoag. There are also other tribal nations who are not federally recognized, including the Massachusetts at Ponkapaug, the Nipmuc Nation, and Wampanoag bands such as Herring Pond. I am simply one of thousands of Indigenous people who come here from tribal nations outside of Massachusetts. And like most of you here, I am a guest on these lands. I start with that context because most non-Native people in Massachusetts are largely unaware of our presence and our histories. I read somewhere that roughly 40% of non-Native people said they don't think they've ever met somebody Indigenous, and that they believe we have died off or that most of us live on reservations. That is simply not the case. Just so you know, nearly 75% of Native people live outside of reservation territories all across the continental US. The Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda is a set of 5 bills presented by an Indigenous-led coalition of organizers working on issues that impact Indigenous peoples in the Commonwealth. The United American Indians of New England and the North American Indian Center of Boston formed this coalition in the 2019-2020 legislative session because we wanted to pull with the same oars rather than be scattered in separate directions working on individual bills. We had 5 bills during that session, one of which was enacted, and it was truly a special thing to see a 30-year-old effort finally cross the finish line. That is the bill to redesign the state flag and seal because of its incredibly racist composite image of an Indigenous person. The first bill in this current session is an act to establish Indigenous Peoples Day. This is deeply personal to so many people who are living and going to school in areas that, in particular, that we are erased from. So for instance, I grew up in Maryland, just outside of Washington, DC, and like so many other children still experience, I was told that I didn't exist. I was told that I had to read racist literature. I was told during football season that I would be sent back to my reservation, and countless other deeply inappropriate things to experience. So I'm here to say Indigenous peoples were not discovered by anybody since we were already here and we were never lost. We did not need to have spirituality or civilization brought to us because we already had those things. And we have an inherent right to continue to live in our own ways and on our own lands. Columbus's policies when he arrived to the island included slave labor, starvation, sex trafficking, rape of children, slaughter, and resulted in the near complete genocide of Indigenous peoples of Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and other places where the Spanish invaded. Altogether, Columbus shipped approximately 5,000 enslaved Indigenous peoples across the Atlantic, filling his pockets and setting the stage for the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of millions of Africans as well as Indigenous people. He sold Indigenous women and girls as young as 9 into sexual slavery. The Spaniards hunted down Taino and Arawak people with huge dogs to tear them apart and devour them. Babies were fed to these dogs. Men tested the sharpness of their blades by cutting off the hands of Indigenous people, a favorite punishment, in fact, when they would not retrieve whatever goods, such as gold or resources, that they were demanding from Indigenous people. The brutality of his actions would reverberate throughout the hemisphere, and other invasions to come would follow in those footsteps. What happened is not a matter of interpretation. When people nowadays try to say that Columbus wasn't so bad or that we're holding him to a standard out of his time and context, and that's unfair. All you have to do is read the firsthand accounts of the priest Bartolome de las Casas, who saw and was horrified, and who accounted for all of those, for as many actions as he could in writing. We're asking for Indigenous Peoples Day to be recognized everywhere in order to educate the public, not only about Columbus, but what's more important is to educate the public, our neighbors, you, about the Indigenous past and present, and the fact that we're still here. We want to stop the harm that's been done to our communities, and especially to the harm that our children face by the continued glorification of Columbus and marginalized Indigenous and the marginalization, of Indigenous people. Celebrating Columbus erases our realities. It erases the decimation, and it seeks to continue to silence us. With the change that can come from this bill, we can actually talk about our continued presence on our own lands. We can talk about the histories and the contributions, the scientific past and futures. And I say scientific that way because most people think of tribal peoples or Indigenous peoples as lacking science and lacking knowledge, but our environment, our waters, our forests, our pristine parks would not be so without the knowledge and the stewardship that we held for time immemorial, that we practiced. So, and I also want to mention that measures like what President Biden offered this year to celebrate both Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day is really no more than acting as though this is some type of political football, that we can celebrate both, because we can't. I can't celebrate someone who brought genocide upon my people at the same time as celebrating the fact that my ancestors were able to survive that so that I could be here today. There's no place, there's simply no place for Columbus and for Columbus Day. Our second bill serves to promote the education on Native American culture and history. This bill would address the lack of Indigenous curriculum in Massachusetts public schools. School children here rarely learn about Native American history, and that's true for school children almost everywhere. Instead of learning that they're on the traditional territories, for instance, of the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Aquinnah, the Mashpee, they learn that our people were conquered. They learn that Indians simply have casinos, and they don't get to learn, again, those traditional pieces of knowledge that allow our land and our waters to be what they are today. They don't get to learn the fact that our governments, that US governments, were founded on Indigenous models. They don't get to learn that Indigenous people were actually inclusive of women and upheld matriarchs in political contexts. All of those things are erased, and we are simply cast as tribal people without technology, without knowledge, without structure, without spirituality, and without humanity. So it's really important that we actually create a system where the tribes from this region can work with the state to develop a curriculum that makes sense. In other states, such as Montana, they call these efforts Indian Education for All. And what it really does is teach people how to actually work with each other. It teaches people to recognize each other's humanity and to move forward and create better communities, better, stronger communities and governments that are actually going to work for our future. Our third bill in this legislative session is a bill to prohibit Native American mascots. currently there are about 38 public high schools in the state that use Native American mascots. This bill would task the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education with establishing regulations to prohibit Native American mascots in our public schools. Decades of science, of social science research have showed that Native American mascots are harmful not only to Native American children, but also non-Native youth, and they perpetuate really harmful stereotypes. The National Congress of American Indians and over 115 tribal governments, educations, professional, civil rights, and religious organizations in the United States have recognized the negative health impacts of Native American mascots and have called for their elimination. Native youth have the highest rate of suicide in this country, and polls among Native organizations that track the outcomes of our young people have pointed back to the fact that these children are erased in school, that they are not reflected in curriculum, that they are harassed by their peers, and then reduced to a simple mascot, reduced to an image, and then told that that image then honors them, and that we are only celebrated for being an idea, but not an actual person. Our fourth bill in this legislative session is one to improve Indigenous educational outcomes. This would create the permanent commission relative to the education of American Indian and Alaska Native residents of the Commonwealth. So beyond having a curriculum that is actually reflective of the tribal peoples who are here and can speak to the real issues that Massachusetts needs to both learn about and face in order to move forward. And in addition to removing racist imagery, we also need to be able to look at what the data is with our children in the schools. You know, currently there's no real data, there's no effective, I should say, data collection process that is able to capture where our Native students are, what they are learning, and therefore what their outcomes are. And from something like that, from that type of information, you know, we would be able to know, well, what type of programs do we need to create, or what things are not working, and how do we address those and make sure that our young people are aging into a system that's not only created for them, but also a system that they are proud to be in, that they can live in, that they are able to afford housing, to be an entrepreneur if they want to, you know, to really create the future that they want and deserve. So this commission would bring together, for instance, stakeholders that are meaningful to the outcomes of our youth. That can include the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, of course. It would include representation from workforce development circles, from entrepreneurship circles, and others. And of course, tribal representatives who would be there to help guide this process. And so something like this, you know, is just, it's the less sexy work that's needed to make sure that something is effective, because without it, we can do, you know, we can do the work, we can run in circles trying to create something, but without any type of real evaluation process, we don't know how to move forward. And so finally, our fifth bill is an act to protect Native American heritage. And this is something that, again, is a little less sexy, but for me and for countless other Native peoples, something like this would actually ensure that the remains of our ancestors, that funerary objects, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony are actually held by us and are cared for by us, that they're not held in governmental, municipal, or nonprofit collections, and that they are not sold for profit. And this bill would allow law enforcement to preserve cultural heritage and deter the trafficking of these objects that simply rely on the current federal legislation called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, APRA. Part of, and I just want to share a little bit about how this final bill came into creation. There was a reporter who called my office at the North American Indian Center of Boston and asked for comment on the sale of sacred items at an auction at a Medford library, a public library. And I had no idea what she was talking about. So, thank goodness for her, but she sent over all the information that she had. We quickly got in touch with the city and with other stakeholders that needed to be in the conversation. And we simply reminded them that as an institution that receives public funding, they are also held to federal laws like NAGPRA and ARPA, and that the sale of our sacred items is absolutely unacceptable. So, thank goodness for someone who sought out an Indigenous comment, but what they were really doing was ensuring that Indigenous people were involved. And that's the type of true allyship that I think is worth building on. It's when you recognize that there is a problem, that something is broken, or that there is a missing piece, and you ensure that you have done something to address that. So part of, or really what we're asking for is not only for you to support the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda, but to also get involved. This type of work is more than passing a bill. Yes, we do. We do very much need that part of your efforts. But what makes something like this work is to continue, to learn about whose land you're on, to go through the process of understanding what a land acknowledgement is, why it is significant, and what is your part as a person, as a neighbor, as a part of the fabric of an entire community. What is your part to uphold the rights of Indigenous people and the treaties, which are the supreme law of this land, and to make sure that we are holding our state government and our local governments accountable to that. So those are some things that you can think about, and hopefully things that will motivate you to get engaged with this work. I do it because it's not just about making improvements here in the state of Massachusetts. It's about setting the tone for a nation. So many states, governments, nonprofits, they look to what happens in Massachusetts. They look to what happens in Boston as an example to follow. And it's my responsibility, I feel, being in this land, to help that along the way. And I know that I can do this work because my ancestors survived genocide. I hope that I do this work so that future generations can address other problems and not continue to be invisibilized, to be erased, and to be looked at as a simple static image from the past. So thank you. I hope to answer, I hope that I can answer any questions later on in the Q&A. And I do see that some information has been dropped in the chat. So please do go to the website. Please do come out for Advocacy Day, sign up, get your organizations to endorse the legislative agenda. This is deeply important work, but we simply can't do it without you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel. for carefully walking through each bill and why they're important. So thank you for taking the time to slowly go through that. It's so helpful, and also for that very powerful call to action. So thank you for being here. Yes, do just as Raquel said, check out the chat if you want to review all of those bills. I know it's a lot of information. The website in the chat is really helpful. It lays out each one really nicely, so please do check that out. So thank you, Raquel. We are now going to move on to Mwalim. So Mwalim Peters, if you want to hop on, there he is. We were talking earlier, he's joining us from the International Space Station today. It's so lovely to have you here, Mwalim. Thank you for joining us. And I know you're going to talk a little bit about the Indigenous perspective on how Indigenous history and culture is and is not represented. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you. In terms of the pieces that I wanted to address, in that a lot of it is sort of the invisible intersections of history and the way history is presented in that manner. You have colonists and those who came with the colonists who land, and we then become monoliths. And when I say monoliths, I'm saying of Black and brown people, of your indigenous people, as well as your African people who were here, who were brought here. In the history books, we become sort of like the monolithic problem, if you will. And the history and the stories, of course, then it becomes cases of what we would refer to as administrative genocide. They were not actually able to get rid of Native people, so what they did was, through administrative means, denied our existence or transferred our existence. And of course, what we have to first look at are the laws laid out in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1675, when they begin to develop the legal definitions of race, as well as the strata of who and who cannot be chattel slavery, who can and cannot own land because they can or cannot be a citizen. So this is where we begin to see the divide of the Black and brown. We see the Black and brown divide appear later with legislation created by Thomas Jefferson. So the question becomes, how do the people, how do the cultures survive? And a lot of it becomes that cross-section or that intersection. And a lot of it became the bits and pieces of personal history that I began to look at, just to try to figure out, why do these patterns happen? For example, for the people of Massachusetts, by the way, I need to make one minor correction. Wampanoag is a nation, not a tribe. Mashpee is a tribe, Aquina is a tribe, Chappaquiddick, Herring Pond, a Sonnet, Seekonk, those are tribes, but Wampanoag is a nation. And very significant to look at that, because when we start to look at territory and we start to look at the spreading of territory and tribal jurisdiction, one of the things that we also have to look at is that tribes, at one point, your tribe was based on who you lived with, who your people were. And it's the post-colonial concept of tribe that now turns it into a sort of pedigree catalog, if you will. It now becomes a matter of lineage and line. So this is where we begin to see points of confusion and transference. When we look at our connective histories, this is where we run into the interesting situations. For example, you have a person like Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was both of Wampanoag and Nipmuc ancestry and was living among the people of the Nipmuc. But we do know from his last name, Attucks, his last name means deer in Wampanoag, Attucks. So that's one of the things that his name carries. Now, at the time of his murder in 1770, he's listed, when you read the papers on the Athenaeum, Boston Athenaeum, he's listed both as mulatto in some instances, and in some instances he's recognized as native. And the mulatto term did not just simply apply to being European and African, but it was also a term applied to being Native and African in this region. Well, Crispus Attucks is recognized as a Native person up until conveniently, for the sake of abolition, he then the African side is brought forward. So now Crispus Attucks is a Black man, because what we have to look at is the imposition of eugenics into the new colonial structure. The imposition of eugenics adopted from Blumenbach, where you now have racial categories and racial strata. So when you create categories, now you can't be, this is the beginning of the check one that you encounter when you have to identify yourself ethnically informed. They've now done away with that, but for the longest time it was ethnicity, check one, check the one that applies. When we look at all of these elements and all of these pieces of history, including the monolithic element, what reading two books at the same time back in college was what really set me on the path of trying to uncover the monolith, if you will, when I look at history. The first book was Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison. The second book was On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And what I came to find was both writers were using the same metaphor. Ralph Ellison is speaking of being the invisible man. And when you're listening to Jack Kerouac and he's talking about the Beat generation, when he speaks of his encounters with people of color, he's encountering monoliths. He's not encountering people. But when he encounters natives, when he encounters Mexicans, when he encounters Black people, he encounters monoliths. And this is even true down to the fact that he engages in a relationship with somebody of Mexican. You're still me when I'm reading this. And then when I'm looking at what Ralph Ellison is saying, for me, it became a matter of how do you explore the monolith? How do you lift the people out of that clump? And it really becomes then a matter of, we look at personalities, we look at archetypes, we look at all of the same basic elements that we look at when we're creating characters in any kind of situation in theater. And when creating these characters and digging into history, we look at the historic circumstances, we look at personalities, and then we're able to get some kind of sense of how would people react? Who were the people? What were the people? What were the lives of the people? What were the experiences of the people? Even when we speak of the atrocities of Columbus, that were so heinous that even he was brought to trial by the same people who sent him to commit them. But when we look at these atrocities, again, we're looking at the atrocities committed against a monolith. But how do we give but when do we start to actually explore the people that these atrocities are happening to? Now, we get to see this happen with the Eastern European Holocaust, the Eastern European Judaic Holocaust that took place in the 30s, took place in Germany and Poland. We see the exploration of the human beings and the humanity and those who experienced those atrocities. And now that has made that experience very human to all of us, the Diary of Anne Frank, the various films, the piano, etc. But now it becomes the responsibility of the artists, the writers, the historians. It becomes our responsibility to actually explore, to actually bring these people to life. The incredible work that was done by the late, great August Wilson in terms of, this is the kind of revelation that we need to start doing ourselves as Native people, and also in terms of removing the monolith. The funny thing with that type of writing becomes now we had a William Yellow Road, we have a Thompson Highway, we have a Sherman Alexie. So it's sort of like, okay, so since we have those writers, we don't need to explore any other Native experience. Of course, let's completely erase the fact that, all right, so what we're looking at is the Canadian experience. We're looking at the Northwestern North American territory experience. We're looking at the Midwestern experience, but we're not all the same people, 500 plus nations. So it becomes a matter of digging our stories up, bringing our stories to life, and bringing our histories to life, bringing our the people of our histories to life, bringing our, and even in terms of celebrating through theater, celebrating our not so recent departed, our not so recent ancestors, but those are some of the personalities that have endured colonization, that have endured white supremacy. How do we celebrate that strength? And when I say celebrate, I don't just mean simply in a gloss over. When I say celebrate, I'm using it in the true sense of the word, in terms of bring to light, examine, explore, highlight, etc. This becomes the importance. And again, it becomes the matter of our history, our storytelling, our form of storytelling, our styles of storytelling. In terms of writing the piece, Listen to Sipu, a lot of it was stepping outside of a lot of the constructs of Western theater and incorporating our storytelling style, the storytelling in the round, the storytelling by the fire, the storytelling by the river, but within our forum, telling it as a story out in nature, making it the exchange, having the exchange between the elder and the youth, that type of thing. So these are the bits and pieces that sort of influence that type of exploration, that type of storytelling, and also just understanding the culture, and also being able to delineate the constructs of tradition versus contemporary. There's an art and there's an aesthetic to both. And we have some people who consider themselves traditionalists, and they are traditionalists and they maintain tradition, but that's not the only piece of the story. We have created incredible arts, branches of our traditions, art, culture, etc., that were a result of the impact of colonization, which is, just another celebration of the endurance of survival. The fact that we're able to take that which is presented to us and acculturate it and adopt it into our own process, our own ability. The fact that we can use theater as a forum for our approach to storytelling and to tell our stories. The fact that we can use literature and film. The fact that we now even have been able to break out of the gatekeeper shackles, if you will. Digital media has opened up so many avenues for people that we can take responsibility of being able to tell our stories. We can tell our stories with iPhones and with downloadable editing equipment. So, this is this is, I guess, the future. And I guess, honestly, this is where I would end it in terms of the discussion of exploring our history, exploring our culture.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mwalim. I was just so engrossed in your story, I forgot that or your response, that I forgot I had to come on. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Really important reminder of how powerful the arts can be for cultural exchange and to correct false narratives. So thank you for that. Also, I just wanted to share for folks who are joining us who may not know what Listen to Sipu is, I just wanted to share that Mwalim wrote an extremely powerful performance piece called Listen to Sipu. It was a commissioned piece through New Repertory Theater. And that went up, let's see, what is time during this pandemic? Oh dear, but this was last spring, spring 2021, that's when it went up. So thank you to those who may have been able to come out and see it. And if not, there are a lot of discussions about how to bring that piece into local schools, and in general, just how can we bring that piece back to life. So thank you, Mwalim, for joining us and sharing about that. So now I'd like to invite on our last panelist for this afternoon, Dr. Mishy Lesser, who will focus on local issues and ways to address Indigenous erasure in our local communities. Hi, Mishy.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Raquel and Mwalim. I feel humbled to be on this panel with you. As a settler residing in Watertown, I want to share with you what it was like when my husband, Chris Ives, and I moved here almost 20 years ago. Allow me to say up front that this is not going to be a history lesson. I'm an educator, not a historian, and I want to share with you my experience of being here and trying to decode this place, which has become our home. I knew little of our new town other than its spectacular Armenian delis, but soon noticed historical markers on bridges, and at the river's edge, I saw a founder's monument to Richard Saltonstall, flanked by Roger Clapp and George Phillips, and in front of the library, a stone marker announcing George Washington had passed through in 1775. I learned of a time capsule to be opened on the town's 400th anniversary in 2030, and of the brass plaque mounted over the door of Fowl House on Marshall Street, headquarters of the Watertown Historical Society. During the British occupation of Boston, the seat of the government of Massachusetts was in Watertown, it told me. And of course, I learned about the Treaty of Watertown, the first foreign treaty concluded by the US after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. But there was no historical context to help me connect the dots between and among these plaques, monuments, and dates. And I yearned to better understand what really happened here, especially in relation to the original inhabitants to live on and care for this land. I found whispers of them in the names of a few streets and parks, and of course in the town seal that memorializes the original peoples as Indians who are friends of the white man. But I didn't see anything from an Indigenous perspective in our shared public space. Then one day, almost a decade ago, when walking to catch the bus, I paused and looked at the monument to Christopher Columbus in our town square, otherwise referred to as the Delta. My jaw dropped. By this time in my life, I was already on my own journey to unlearn the settler narrative and was trying to cut through the thicket of historical falsehoods about our town, state, and country. In my professional life as co-founder of Upstander Project, we had already begun work on our documentary film, Dawnland, which focuses on the Wabanaki in the place now called Maine, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission they created to discover the truth behind the forced removal and coerced assimilation of their children by state child welfare agents bent on making them white. The film won an Emmy for Outstanding Research in 2018, by the way, and my research for the film and its teacher's guide helped inform the questions I began to ask about what I was seeing and not seeing here in Watertown as I tried to make connections between dates and names of mostly white men to help me decode the narrative of our new hometown. Here's a brief summary of what I learned. The cultural landscape of what existed here for thousands of years was defined by the presence and contributions of the Pigsgusset Band of the Massachusetts tribe and other Indigenous peoples who lived here, especially in spring, summer, and fall. In spite of English claims of being the first at everything, Indigenous people in this region lived rich and complex lives for well over 400 generations. Let that sink in, 400 generations before English and other Europeans immigrated here. The original peoples of this land were skilled cultivators, fishermen, and hunters, and they created scores of walking paths that wove together their settlements, hunting grounds, and prime river crossings. The erasure of stories, culture, contributions, hopes, and dreams of the Pigsgusset Band of the Massachusetts tribe began with the arrival of English settlers. The river is known to its original inhabitants as Quinobaquin, or Winding River. Erasing Indigenous peoples and relegating them to the past helped undermine their claims to land and rights and spread the myth of terra nullius, which suggests the land belonged to no one because God had conveniently cleared it for English occupation and settlement. The narrative of Indigenous extinction gained a strong foothold here 400 years ago. After Captain John Smith sailed north from Virginia in 1616, in other words, before the settlement of Watertown by English, he made a map of the coastline and nearby towns with Algonquin place names. That map was sent to England, where 15-year-old Crown Prince Charles instructed Smith to change all the names to English ones. This was another big step toward erasure. The founding of Watertown not soon thereafter in 1630 made it a settler stronghold. The town was almost as populated as Boston. The Saltonstall Plantation, the first English name for this place, was inhabited by breeders of livestock who acquired vast amounts of land for horses, sheep, and cattle. The presence of livestock was destructive to Indigenous lifeways. English settlers also constructed fish weirs in the river that were harmful to the original peoples and others who lived upstream and downstream. In 1631, Watertown militia was officially established. Men between 16 and 60 were required to serve and supply their own weapons. That same year, in May, the General Court voted that only approved church members could be named freemen and thereby afforded the right to vote. A few years later, in 1634, Watertown residents were struggling to feed themselves. Many English settlers were impoverished in this region, in this vast region known by Indigenous peoples to the north as the Dawnland. And as they were struggling to feed themselves, some traveled in search of bushels of corn lest they die of starvation. The settlers also demanded representation and sent a delegate to the first court of delegates. Watertown militia members participated in raids of Indigenous villages on what we now refer to as Block Island, where they burned villages and captured people. They also participated in the attack on the Pequot in 1637 in Connecticut in what is now referred to as the Pequot War. Nearby, segregated spaces were created, which are really like the equivalent of the reservations that exist in other parts of the United States. Indigenous people were banished to 14 English Christian praying towns established by John Eliot. Meanwhile, just 10 miles away in Boston, colonial officials began issuing scalp acts at the outset of what's referred to as the Second Anglo-Abenaki War. Some call it King William's War in the late 1600s. Let me clarify what we're talking about here. We're talking about the monetization of the hunting, capture, and scalping of Indigenous children, women, and men all over what is now called New England. Most of the orders for these scalp acts were made in the old State House on the second floor in the council chamber. And the first of those scalp proclamations was signed in 1712. I want to underscore that scalping was part of a massive and unwavering land grab in this region, including here in Watertown. Colonial authorities used every means at their disposal to ethnically cleanse Indigenous people from the land. And with the issuance of these scalp proclamations starting in the late 1600s, the amount of money that was offered steadily climbed for the next century. So that amount, by the time we get to 1756, 300 pounds were offered for the scalps of Indigenous peoples in this region. And anybody who wants to do the math, 40 pounds roughly equal to $12,000. So we're talking about extraordinary amounts of currency and also land that were given to those who participated in scalping of Indigenous peoples in this region. All of this is the context for what we refer to as Pometacomet's resistance, or is more commonly known as King Philip's War, which is a regional Indigenous uprising in 1675. I think many of you know that while Watertown militia played a role in these battles, the Massachusetts Council in October of 1675 decided to exile between 500 and 1,000 Christian Indians, children, women, and men, including the elderly, to the Boston Harbor Islands without food, proper clothing, shelter, or medicine. They were taken from their homes at night in Natick. They were shackled, dragged in chains, loaded into horse-drawn carts, and brought here to Watertown, to a place called the Pines, where they were put into canoes and taken to 3 ships in the Boston Harbor that ferried them to Deer Island, where they were prohibited from harvesting any timber in order to keep themselves warm. And it is predicted that it is estimated that at least half of them died. There were also enslaved people in Watertown, both Indigenous and kidnapped Africans. And according to the 1754 slave census, 119 towns gave records totaling 2,720 slaves. And in Watertown, there were 7 male slaves and 6 female slaves. I want to just say one more thing about the context for the Treaty of Watertown that is talked about and commemorated every summer here in town. I spoke with some colleagues, Passamaquoddy colleagues who are scholars of this, and I asked them how they understand the Treaty of Watertown, and what they said was that Indigenous peoples, especially in in this region and to the north, were going through a very difficult period at the time. They were living in decimated states and their societies had been ravaged, and different tribes took different sides as the Americans were gearing up to fight the British. And after, during the Revolutionary War, the Americans didn't have the money or the people power they needed to engage in a full-scale war against the English. And Indigenous people were desperate. They were desperate to survive scalping and mass conversion to Christianity. And so the treaty was signed in the context of a lot of despair. And I attended the commemoration once here in Watertown on a July 19th. And none of that context was made clear to me at that moment, at that event. I also want to just say something about the Watertown seal. It is part of the false narrative about friendship and peace between the original peoples and the English newcomers that we're still dealing with today. And most of us who are non-native have been fed this myth. And I guess I would pose the question, how can a town be founded in peace if other people's land was occupied and taken from them? And if someone says, well, there was a deed that was signed, I would suggest that we look at the larger historical context that was so overflowing with violence against Indigenous peoples before, we take deeds that might have been signed over to settlers as if that proves that land was not stolen. There's a move here in town among some of us to change the town seal. And we hope that you all will join us in that effort. In my own process of learning and unlearning, I also came upon some of the contemporary challenges around the history of a native mascot here. The Red Indian was a sports mascot in Watertown, and some revered and perhaps still do revere it as a symbol, but to most of us, it's an offensive, harmful stereotype that dehumanizes the original peoples of this land. In the early 2000s, Red was dropped from the Raiders, and it took 7 years for there to be a new mascot. Meanwhile, a Save the Watertown Red Raider group appeared on Facebook, and fairly recently, Red made a comeback in an offensive sticker that some of us saw here in public places. Someone went to the trouble to design and print these stickers as they tried to resurrect him. So to wrap up, I want to pose some questions for us to chew on. How can we work together to activate a full accounting of history in our town and its public places? How can we as a community peel back the layers of the onion to see the violent history of displacement, disease, segregated communities, forced conversion, and destruction of lifeways, and the impossible position the original peoples of this land were put in? How can we come to see this broad web of interacting forces that led to the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from this place? Can we embrace on erasure as a shared responsibility in our community? That can take many forms, but it begins with renaming the Delta, because it is still legally the Columbus Delta. And that should happen as part of a community-wide conversation. We also need to reimagine our town seal. We need to infuse our school curriculum with Indigenous history, voices, perspectives, and not in an episodic way every November when it's Native American Heritage Month, but across all grades, all subject matters, and all months of the year. Indigenous knowledge systems have much to contribute to our own understanding of how to walk in a good way with one another and with the earth that sustains us. We are all responsible for the future. As my friend and colleague Sarah Shear said this past summer at the Upstander Academy for Teachers, when referring to the role of those of us who are non-Native in the process of unerasure, we may not be the ones our ancestors wanted, but we are the ones they deserve. And so I ask, what conversations do we need to reimagine, to reimagine the center of town? Who should come to the table as part of that conversation? And how do we steer clear of the rocky shoals that may suggest that by removing the name of Christopher Columbus, we are somehow offending Italian-American neighbors who we know were persecuted and treated with extreme violence upon their arrival in this country. And they were looking for a way to affirm themselves and protect themselves. We understand that. It's just unfortunate that they connected themselves to an architect of genocide. And it's time for us to reckon with that past. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mishy. You left us with a lot of questions there to think about. So thank you for sharing that. Lots of necessary thoughts and questions to think about for today and beyond. Remember, we're not going to have all the answers today. This is a space to throw out questions and thoughts and percolate. So thank you, Mishy. I would love to now invite all of our panelists to join me again back on screen. We may have lost Mwalim, but hopefully he can join us again. I was chatting with Jennifer earlier in preparation for this event. Jennifer is a Pigsgusset Initiative member and the woman behind the camera today helping us with tech stuff. And she said, you know, I feel like the best part of these panel discussions is when everybody leaves and the panelists get to talk. That's when really the good stuff happens. So it's really important to us that we left a little bit of time for our three panelists. It might just be, hopefully Raquel can join us. Just for the three of you or the two of you, if it happens to be, to share any reflections you may have had from listening to each other talk or questions you might have for each other. So I wanted to open that space up.
Thank you.
Raquel, are you able to join us? There she is. Wonderful, thanks.
Raquel, I would love to ask you a question. How do you see the main barrier to passage of the bills that make up the Massachusetts Legislative Indigenous Agenda? And what can a small group like the Pigsgusset Initiative in one small city do to mobilize more support?
Thank you for that. I think there are a number of barriers, and you know that's similar to the passage of really almost any bill. But in particular, when we're talking about Indigenous issues, it always starts with the basic education, and that's around, you know, do we exist? What are the tribes that are local to somebody's area? And then, you know, do you understand how to interact with those peoples? And it's normally an answer that is somewhere along the lines of, I don't know who my local tribes are, or I know that there's an Indian casino, or I have been to a powwow. But that's really the extent of how people are relating to one another, and that's really what has to change. So it starts with conversations like these, and it ends with actually passing a bill in that lifetime. But then, as I said, the longer work is actually understanding what it means to move forward. So in the using the example of the bill that we passed last legislative session, the bill to change the flag and seal, it took groups like this one meeting. It took people talking to their neighbors, talking to their congregations, their school programs, joining in coalition with each other and coming to these learning sessions to start to unpack what the history is, to face our own privileges and our own part in not only how, you know, systems of erasure are upheld in an everyday way, but also to start to get to know each other and figure out, you know, how do we dismantle that? How do we be better to each other and actually live our values? Because most of us have some core values that include, you know, being good to one another, learning about each other, I grew up with the term, working across the aisle. I don't know how many folks use that still, but that was seen as something, working together and compromise, but also doing long-term work. Seemed to be talked about a little bit more favorably, and I think we've gotten away from some of that. So it's also means that we have to be patient with ourselves and with each other. And so getting back to the example of the bill to change the flag and seal, that was a 30-year conversation that was happening in the state. We in the early days of our coalition, we sat down and we talked with Byron Rushing, with other people who were in key players at the start of that conversation, and tried to learn, what happened, when did it fall apart, what were the arguments back then, and we used that to guide how we approached these learning sessions with small communities and in small settings, small group settings, friendly settings, and take it from there. But now that that bill has passed, there is a commission to evaluate the process, and NACOB continued some of that work with the partnership of a team of students and professors at the Lesley University School of Design. So they actually, they had been following the work and they wanted to figure out a way to help. And so they came to us and they said, how do we help? How do we listen and respond? In my place at a school, at a institution that people look to, again, these places in Massachusetts that we are all a part of, people all over the country look to our schools, to our governments, to our churches, to guide their work and to guide their learning in their own home communities outside of the state. So they listened. We encouraged them to talk to some other stakeholders in the process to figure out, if this was a project that they were truly interested in doing. And we had weekly check-ins with student groups. We relied on them to use their contacts to go out and find, experts in the field of flag design, experts in the museum world to not only put together a report that was given to the commission, that gives them some of that historical context and those citable references that our governments always want. They did all the work of compiling that into this beautiful report and looked at examples of other states and organizations and companies who have changed their racist seal, flag, logo, etc. And now that they have that, they have that took some of the work of compiling all of that, because that project took a year. And so that took on a piece of the work so that the people who are carrying the torch on that commission have firm ground to start on. So there's all kinds of ways to plug in. But as I said, it takes some patience, it takes learning, and then it takes some reflection to figure out what can one person as an individual do to support those efforts, and to know and trust each other as a community enough to say, okay, I did this piece, this is what was helpful, and now I've passed that work on to someone else, and they can take it as far as they can go.
I'm so glad that you put it in that context, because one thing I would love everybody to know is that when we first founded Pigsgusset Initiative, I don't know, a year and a half or longer ago, the first thing I said was, we need like a 3 to 5 year plan. And soon it became, we need a 30-year plan, because we're dealing with 400 years of erasure. And it's so deeply embedded in our local culture that, and in the narratives, And especially if we're going to have impact on, the next generation of learners, and also those who teach them, we have to go slow so that it goes deep, because otherwise we're not really going to anchor new understandings. It's just going to be at the surface. And, I was wondering, because originally the commission to redesign the flag was supposed to render a report in October, and I kept looking for one. Did I miss something?
No, I think it's not to blame COVID, but to blame COVID. I think there was some real troubles or challenges, excuse me, that pretty much all of the commissions have faced during this time. For instance, the Commission on Indian Affairs wasn't allowed to use a particular Zoom link because the state didn't have an agreement to be able to offer those meeting spaces. And so commissioners, were using their own personal resources to be able to still hold these meetings. And I think that was just an example of the challenges to continuing the work, and really, in some cases, starting the work when we're all indoors and dealing with the general troubles of trying to adapt to a new situation. So they are still working on it. Again, with the delays in COVID, some of the commissioners also weren't able to be confirmed in a timely manner. So there were just all sorts of challenges, and I just, I'm thankful that they're still there, being able to carry on this. And I think we'll look at some extension of deadlines, if you will, to make sure that that this doesn't just end because of a pandemic.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's so important. As a Pigsgusset Initiative member I've joined within this last year, I've just learned so much about the importance of being persistent and not giving up. And it's very easy for an event to happen that, gets out there on social media or on the news, and folks have an opinion about it and get motivated, and then time passes. And it's important to continue to say, okay, what about this commission? What's going on? Yes, COVID has delayed us, but we're going to keep pushing. And that's, I think, a really important piece around this, the 30-year journey. This is a lifelong journey for myself as descendants of settlers. I am a settler myself. This is a lifelong journey for me. And I think that isn't a really important piece that I've learned on my journey so far, that I'm not going to figure this out right away. This is not going to happen within a couple of years. This is a lifelong journey. But what can we do now? And these call to actions are so important. I do want to let everybody know joining us, if you have any questions for either of our panelists, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to put them in the chat or Q&A, and we will be monitoring that in case any questions come up.
I would love to address Sue Ellen's really important question, and then see if Raquel has other things to add, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So Sue Ellen's question is, what thoughts do people have about how to minimize or transform Italian Americans' resistance and anger regarding rethinking Columbus? Yeah, I think the most important step forward is for Italian Americans to join us. And there are many who are on this webinar. And some of them are elected officials. Some of them are our neighbors. And some of them are descendants of grandparents who helped, who worked really hard to put the monument of, from the Knights of Columbus in the town square. And it's really important for us to have a dialogue with them. so that they can understand the history that Raquel described and that Mwalim reinforced, and not be dismissed. It's easy for someone like myself, who's not Italian American, to be dismissed. It's already happened in public forums here in town. But I think with Italian American neighbors and colleagues and elected officials, we can begin to have a conversation where we can really hear one another, because that's what's important. It has to start out with an acknowledgement of pain. And there's pain on all sides of this. And the pain that Italian Americans feel when they think back to their grandparents being mistreated in this country and being persecuted is real. And that lives for them today. At the same time, they have to understand that the pain and the intergenerational trauma of Indigenous peoples has hundreds of years. And so there needs to be a productive dialogue across this particular divide. And from there, I trust that we will find a way forward. But it's essential that we have Italian Americans willing to, do you remember in your second slide, Sarah, the ground rules or the group agreements that you offered us? Those would be a perfect starting place for having a conversation across these differences. And I guess what I would like to do is make a public invitation right now to the people who are on this webinar to join us, and that we should do this soon. So that we can have, so we can come to understand one another rather than perhaps being dismissed, which is how I felt the last time I presented on this history. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to uplift a group that's called Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day. They're led by Heather Lavelle, who is the director of the Cyrus Dallin Museum over in Arlington, and Corey Pop. And they have really listened to community. They have spent time building with Native community, and then taking we're able to take that learning back to their own Italian American circles and families, and talk about what it means to recognize the genocide that took place here, the genocide of Indigenous peoples, and to reflect on our country's struggle, real struggle with immigration, and to reflect on our country's struggle to move away from this narrative of pieces of the pie, and understand that there really is a place for everyone, and that we can and should actually treat one another and one another's histories in a way that both honors them and also allows us to really explore, when they're explore those histories and identify things that are learning points, right? We don't have to uphold people who were not good people even in their time. We don't have to accept some of the ugliness in our own past as something that needs to be carried forth into our future. we can learn from it. We can avoid doing those things. We can actually be better people and better architects of a community when we really embrace history, without this need to soften things or to completely glaze over entire swaths of really troubling history. And I think, the group Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day does a lot of that work really well, and they're always open to hearing from people and doing that unpacking with you. And I also want to share a story about I think it was 2015 or 2016, when the city of Cambridge made the change from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. There were absolutely people who grew up as in families or themselves as members of the Knights of Columbus, and they did that work on their own, and they had actually approached a number of Indigenous organizations. That's how I got involved in the Cambridge fight. I was living in Cambridge at the time, going to school at Harvard. They got in touch with Harvard University Native American program, and the North American Indian Center of Boston, and United American Indians of New England. And they said to us, look, we want to make this change. We're ready to talk about it, and we're ready to just move forward. And thank goodness they did. I mean, it was a little bit of a surprise, but they moved quickly because they already did some of that background work of interrogating themselves and interrogating their own histories to arrive to a point that helped them to move forward with a bill to right a wrong. And we're still working with Cambridge to make sure that, their small business association is actually inclusive of Native people, that their actions as a city are not discriminatory towards Native people in their housing or policing policies. Those are the real effects of colonization that carry on into the everyday lives that Indigenous people have here. So, the fact that they were ready at the time to make that change helped them to just pass the darn bill. And so we can take that energy into any city. You guys can take that energy and do that, and you guys can pass these bills.
Thank you. Sarah, is it okay if I address Felicia's question?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
So I'll read the question. I would love advice on how parents can advocate for their children to have a curriculum that centers the experience of Indigenous people. The response is typically, we don't create the curriculum, it's DESE, the Department of Early Childhood and Secondary Education. What can we do on the local level? Felicia, thank you for this question. There is so much that we can do. I want to tell you a story. Last spring, I believe it was, the city of Wakefield was very much in the news. I don't know if any of you recall that there was a big struggle going on between elected officials, the school committee, teachers, students over a logo, a Native logo. And the administration of the district, the teachers and the students wanted to go in a direction of respect toward Indigenous peoples and learning more. And there was a very different sentiment that was coming from other elected bodies. And what the district did was they reached out to us at the Upstander Academy. And for those who don't know, the Upstander Academy is an annual 6-day learning experience with majority Indigenous faculty to learn about genocide against Indigenous peoples in this country. And it's immersive, and it's the word that we most often hear when people come through it is that it's transformational. transformational of what and how they teach. And Wakefield asked if they could come to the Upstander Academy because they wanted to fortify their knowledge and their understanding about Indigenous history, present and futures, so that they could be better positioned to serve the students in their district. And what they have done since they sent 2 teachers to the Upstander Academy, and teachers came from other districts where the parents actually created a GoFundMe campaign to send the teachers so that they could embark on their own process of anti-colonial learning and their process of unlearning as settlers. And what has happened with the cohort that graduated this past summer? And I think we all know that this education space is contested now nationally in very pronounced ways. And so teachers who have knowledge and are part of a courageous community do teach this history. And the reasoning of, we don't make curriculum, it's the Department of Early Childhood and Secondary Education that makes, that's not the excuse anymore when you have teachers who have knowledge and who have resources at their disposal. And I guess what I would say, Felicia, is as a parent, we would love to have you join us for conversation at the Pigsgusset Initiative so that we can support you in identifying other parents in the district who want to teach Indigenous history, and not just in the month of November. And we will find ways, and Pigsgusset Initiative is actually working on this, to get funding so that Watertown teachers, especially from the high school, can attend next summer's Upstander Academy. So I don't know what age your children are, but please reach out to us so that we can continue the conversation with you about this.
Thank you, Mishy. And I want to give it over to Raquel if you want to follow up or piggyback on that at all. But I did want to see, I see in the chat that Connie said, just to clarify, the Department of Early Education, Secondary Education is responsible for our content standards, but not for choosing of curriculum. There is a greater emphasis on primary sources. So that's helpful too, to keep in mind. Thank you, Mishy. Raquel, did you have anything you wanted to say after that?
Yeah, I'll just add something quickly, but Mwalim's, the native educator in the room, and I see him back in the room with us. If you want to teach native curriculum, native history, first of all, reach out to native education departments. Look to what is already being done in this state. Second of all, link in with the folks in your community who are going to support those efforts, because when a teacher goes and includes some of this content in their classroom, a very common response is that those teachers are identified by administrations and angry parents who want to know why they're teaching their child that, Columbus wasn't a great guy. Or that teach their children that the history, that native history, is actually something that is still happening and didn't just end, in whatever war period they're covering in their social studies or histories classes. And second, and third of all, when you have that support and when you are actually looking to the examples and the facts of history, right? They will always frame it as, well, this is revisionist. And, in fact, there are lots of sources, there are lots of original sources that support all of this. And there is science that has already proven the Bering Strait theory wrong. All of that is there, and it needs to be brought into the conversation with celebration. We need to frame the discussion of education in a way that that lets people know we're actually training our children for the future. We are training them to interrogate history and to be able to deal with complex histories and take that learning and passion and take it into the future to really move forward as a community, as a country that is going to do things like, tie it back to the Constitution and our original founding documents. We are here to uphold treaties. Ultimately, we are here to uphold the supreme law of the land. That is the importance of learning about this, because without that, without treating Native history as an elective or an elective in law school, they're never going to learn we as a nation are never going to learn what the actual laws are. What are the responsibilities to tribes? And how does that shape our climate policy? How does that shape our transportation policy? So that, those are the big pictures that folks can tie in to shape those conversations when they're going to happen in your home districts. But again, Mwalim's the instructor here. That history is there. Folks just gotta tap into it and treat it as a living, breathing history that is outside of, or that is beyond Indigenous Peoples Day, that is beyond Native American Heritage Month, and something that is breathing life into our curriculum throughout the year and informing the way that we treat the world around us and each other.
Thank you. I see that Mwalim is here. So Mwalim, if you wanted to share anything on the topic now that you're back. Sorry, we lost you for a bit. I just want to open some space to you if you'd like it. Okay. Well, feel free to chime in if you're able. I do also see our time. I can't believe how quickly this panel has gone by. I do want to get to Chris's question, and I think that will be our last question for our event today. So I'll read it, and Mishy and Raquel and Mwalim, if you have any thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. So Chris asks, are there any discussions happening now about the Watertown seal having appeared in the architectural plan for the new high school?
So I'll just give a little bit of background on that. For those who live in town, you know that there's a new high school that's being designed. And we learned that the architects who don't live here were somehow enchanted by the false narrative of the fish and the biscuit and wanted the story that's emblazoned in the current seal. And they wanted to somehow incorporate that into some part of the design. And so Pigsgusset Initiative wrote letters, and we tried to get some attention on the matter. And as far as I know, and Jennifer, please correct me in the chat or by turning on your video if I'm wrong, we made inquiries, our inquiries were acknowledged, and then things stalled. And so if we still have our elected officials on this call, I hope you are still here. We are very concerned about this, and we want a conversation because we don't think that that's going to be the seal of Watertown going forward. we think that the seal needs to be revisited, just like the flag of the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so rather than incorporating the false narrative into a new high school, which should really reflect forward-looking thinking, yeah, we need to have a different kind of intervention here. So we're looking to, yeah, so Jennifer says I'm correct, no follow-up on our requests from school personnel to address the concerns regarding the new high school. And we have sent a few messages about this. So right here, folks, this is an example of how erasure continues. And if we don't speak up as a community, then another generation is going to be socialized thinking that that false narrative is truth. And so we absolutely have to speak up about this.
Thank you, Mishy, and thank you for asking that question, Chris. It looks like, great, we answered that. It looks like those were all of our questions there. Great. So I think so much information from this, from our talk today. So thank you both, Raquel and Mishy, and to Mwalim as well, for giving us your time, sharing your experiences, sharing your knowledge with us, and sharing some really powerful call to actions. Yes, Mishy.
Can I just say that
Yep.
our district's town councilor just mentioned in the chat that he's on the school building committee and never got any correspondence on that. Vinny, we're very grateful to you for speaking up about that. That's very disturbing to us that you never received that information, and we will make sure that the letter that we sent gets into your hands, and we hope that the school building committee will give it serious attention.
Yeah, thank you, Vinny. And let us know if there's a specific way we can send it to you or anything like that, we're happy to take any information like that. Mwalim, did you want to chime in?
One thing I just wanted to share with everybody, this is more of a arts and entertainment type thing. November 27th, day of mourning weekend in Mashpee, at the Native Gallery in the Mashpee Commons, we're doing a presentation called Wampanoag, which is basically a celebration of Wampanoag and other Native musicians who are electronic music producers in house music, hip hop, EDM. So there'll be the music of groups like A Tribe Called Red, but our featured artists will include Asa Peters, who's currently a grad student at UMass, Boston, but a jazz player as well. ZYG 808, who's hip hop and hyper pop, and some of my music in new jazz and house music will also be featured. But that's going to be November 27th at 7 p.m. at the Native Gallery in Mashpee, and it's called Wampanoag.
Great, thank you, Mwalim. I will, Wampanoag. I'm gonna see if I can find, is there a website, Mwalim, that I can direct people to?
Right now, the best website would be the ZYG808.com.
808.com. Okay, great.
The yeah, that's probably the best one to go to. And then I'm sorry, there's a backslash. It's slash TNSC. So the ZYG808.com/TNSC.
Fabulous. Okay, I'm gonna drop that in the chat right now for everyone. Wonderful. I also know that there's a virtual lobbying event happening, I believe, is it November 18th coming up? Raquel, are you able to speak about that?
Yes, there is a virtual lobby day that is happening on the 18th. We are asking that folks who are interested in speaking with their representative and senator, and there's some training beforehand, so we're not just letting folks loose everywhere, to be uninformed. There's some preparation, some native speakers, and then those tools you'll take with you and speak to your representatives. I'm going to put the form in the chat. Actually, here, I'll send it to the hosts and panelists. I'm not quite sure how to.
Great. Thank you, Raquel. I think Jennifer just put info for the virtual event on a link there as well. So that's great. And I think it would be really helpful, Jennifer, and we can chat about this offline, but to send to all of our attendees today, just some links that we shared in the chat. So folks, if you didn't get it from our chat today, we will follow up with a bunch of this information, as well as the recording of the event today. So we wanted to share that. I see that we are running out of time, so I am going to bid everybody farewell. I have some quick thank yous to do on our way out, and then we'll have some of the Groovalatos see us out again. So first, I just wanted to huge thank you again to our panelists. Raquel, for coming in last minute. So appreciate your time and everything you shared with us. To Mwalim, thank you, Mwalim, for coming in and speaking about arts and culture and the work that you do. And for Mishy, everybody check out the Upstander project, Bounty. Their newest short documentary film recently came out. Check that out. So thank you to our panelists. The event today would not have been possible without some generous sponsors, the King Yan Response Team and Progressive Watertown, and of course, the Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment. Also, quick thank yous. Thank you, Eileen Ryan, Jennifer Wolfram, Izzy Toppen DeFries, Matoi Monroe, for all of your help in making today possible. And again, folks, these conversations, this is just the beginning. Please go home, ask some of these questions to your family at dinner, talk to your neighbors. That is so important. So please, I hope that this has engaged you and excited you to move forward into the rest of your day. If you want to continue the conversation with Pigsgusset Initiative, I'm going to leave this slide up as we have folks leaving the room today. Feel free, we're going to drop it in the chat as well. We'd love for you to sign up for our mailing list so you can learn about upcoming events, learn about what's happening, and even join our monthly meetings. Also, if you have any further questions, you can email Jennifer. Her email is right there as well. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday and take care.
This one goes out to Eddie Ray Johnson. Every day is a good day. Rain and wind bring change. Every day is a good day. Tired of you saying that my generation doesn't care. What have you left for us? Besides the light of despair. Waters are polluted. People are living on the streets. Internalized depression is a tool they use to defeat